Watch this. 7 nights. 7 consecutive nights of American bombs falling on Iranian soil, night after night after night, with no sign of stopping. That's not a raid. That's not a warning shot. That is a campaign. And if you were running the war room in Washington right now, you'd probably assume that by night 7, Tehran would be looking for a way out. You'd assume the silence from Iran meant they were breaking. You'd be wrong. Because in the last 24 hours, Iran didn't go quiet. Iran sent a message. And it wasn't the message anyone in Washington was expecting. And to understand exactly how serious that message is, you need to understand everything that led up to this moment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is where we break down what's actually happening in the Iran conflict. Not the noise, not the speculation, just what's confirmed, what it means, and where this is heading. And today's update is a big one, because this war has just entered a phase that almost nobody was talking about a week ago. So stick around, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly why Tehran just changed the tone of this entire conflict. Let's rewind, because you can't understand what just happened without understanding how this war actually started. And honestly, this backstory is wild. This all goes back to February 28th, 2026. That was the day Israel and the United States launched a coordinated operation. Israel's side was called Operation Roaring Lion. The American side was called Operation Epic Fury, against Iran's nuclear, military, and leadership targets all at once. In the first 12 hours alone, nearly 900 strikes hit Iranian soil. And the opening move of that operation wasn't a nuclear facility. It was Iran's supreme leader. Ali Khamenei was killed in those very first strikes, along with several other senior Iranian officials. Within days, his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, was named the new supreme leader through an interim leadership council, an almost unheard of leadership transition forced overnight by war rather than by succession planning. Iran's response was immediate and massive. Hundreds of retaliatory missiles and thousands of drones were launched across the region within the following weeks, targeting U.S. embassies, military installations, and oil infrastructure, including tankers passing through the Strait of Hormuz. This is the moment the Strait, one of the most important oil choke points on the planet, became the central pressure point of the entire war. By April, the United States had escalated further, imposing a full naval blockade on Iran, intercepting dozens of vessels trying to move in or out of Iranian ports. Iran responded by closing the Strait of Hormuz outright. For a few tense weeks, one of the world's busiest shipping lanes was effectively a war zone, and manufacturers and oil markets worldwide braced for the fallout. Then, in April, there was a brief ceasefire. It didn't hold. By early June, fighting had resumed, but diplomacy didn't stop either. And that's the part a lot of coverage skips over. The US and Iran actually sat down together and, through talks based in Islamabad, negotiated a 14-point memorandum of understanding aimed at ending the war for good. As part of that framework, the US lifted its naval blockade on June 18th. Strait of Hormuz shipping traffic started to recover. A separate Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire took hold around the same time. For about a month, it looked like this war might actually be winding down through negotiation instead of continued bombing. That brings us to now. And what you need to understand is this. Everything happening this week, 7 nights of renewed U.S. strikes, Iran hitting back at regional targets, this new warning from Tehran, all of it is happening during what was supposed to be the diplomatic phase of this war. The ceasefire didn't formally end. It just quietly stopped being respected. That's the environment this warning just landed in. So let's get to what actually happened this week. U.S. Central Command confirmed that American forces completed their 7th consecutive night of strikes against Iran. 7 nights in a row. Not a single retaliatory strike, not a limited operation. A sustained bombing campaign that's been running non-stop for over a week, layered right on top of a ceasefire framework that was supposed to be holding. Here's the part most coverage glosses over. This wave of strikes didn't happen in isolation. It came after Tehran launched its own widening series of attacks on U.S. allies in the region, which means both sides have been escalating in lockstep for a week straight, each one trading blows almost every single night, while officially still inside a negotiated peace process. Pause on that for a second. 7 nights of continuous combat between 2 major militaries, in the middle of an active diplomatic framework, and neither side has blinked. That alone tells you the Islamabad memorandum is barely holding together at this point. But here's where it gets more dangerous, because this war just spilled over its borders again. Kuwait's fire force confirmed that firefighters had to extinguish 2 separate fires after sites in the south of the country were struck in what officials called hostile Iranian attacks. Soldiers were wounded. Military and civilian facilities were damaged. Let that sink in. Kuwait, a U.S. ally, not a direct combatant in this war, just took hits. This is exactly the kind of regional spillover that people feared back in April when the Strait of Hormuz first shut down. A war that started as a bilateral fight between Iran, Israel, and the U.S., now pulling in neighboring countries who never asked to be part of it. And almost immediately after, the United States publicly denied a competing claim that it had struck Iranian civilian infrastructure, which tells you something important. Both sides are now fighting a second war, a war over the narrative. At the exact same time, they're fighting the real one. Every strike now comes with a competing story about who did what to whom, which makes de-escalation even harder, because neither side can agree on the basic facts of what's happening night to night. Stop. Sit with that for a second. A regional ally just got hit. Both governments are now managing public perception in real time, mid-conflict. This is no longer a contained two-country war. This is a war that is actively widening 4.5 months after it started with a single decapitation strike in Tehran. Now here's the moment that actually matters most. This is why we're making this video. Former IRGC Commander Major General Mohsen Rezaei went on Iranian state media and delivered a warning that should be getting a lot more attention than it is. He said that if the United States continues its military actions against Iran, Tehran will shift from a retaliatory posture to an offensive one. His exact words, translated, if America continues the war in the coming days, Iran will move from the phase of retaliation to the offensive phase. And he declared that the conditions for both negotiations and war are over. Read that again. Not, we will keep defending ourselves. Not, we will keep retaliating. He said Iran is done retaliating. The next phase, according to this warning, is offense. And this didn't come from an anonymous source or a leaked memo. This came from a former senior IRGC commander on state television, on the record, 4.5 months into a war that was supposed to already be transitioning into a negotiated peace. Think about the psychology behind that timing. This isn't a warning issued in the chaos of the first week of war back in February, when emotions were at their peak after Khamenei's death. This is a calculated statement, issued in July, after ceasefire, after signed memorandum, after a month of relative calm, specifically now on night 7 of a renewed bombing campaign. That context makes it far more deliberate than a heat-of-the-moment threat. So why does this keep happening? Why does this war keep sliding back into open bombing campaigns every time it looks like it's calming down? Here's the pattern if you zoom out across the last 4.5 months. February. Massive opening strikes. Khamenei killed. War begins. Weeks later, naval blockade imposed. Strait of Hormuz shut down in response. April. A ceasefire attempt. Collapses within weeks. June. Renewed fighting, followed by an actual negotiated framework. The Islamabad memorandum, plus the blockade being lifted and shipping traffic recovering. And now July. 7 straight nights of strikes, regional spillover into Kuwait, and a former IRGC commander declaring the negotiation window closed. Every single time this war has approached a genuine off-ramp, something has pulled it back into active combat within weeks. That's not a coincidence, and it's not really surprising once you understand the underlying issue. A ceasefire and a memorandum of understanding are pieces of paper. They don't automatically resolve the actual disputes driving the war. Iran's nuclear program, the balance of power in the Gulf, control of the Strait of Hormuz, and now an entirely new and fragile Iranian leadership structure trying to project strength after the killing of its supreme leader. That last point matters more than people give it credit for. Mojtaba Khamenei inherited leadership of Iran through an emergency succession process in the middle of a war after his father was assassinated in the opening strike. Any new leader in that position has enormous pressure to prove they will not be seen as weak, especially not 4.5 months in, with strikes still landing on Iranian soil on a near-nightly basis. A warning like the one Rezaei just gave doesn't just reflect military calculation. It reflects a leadership under intense pressure to demonstrate resolve. And that's what makes this moment bigger than just Iran and the US. Look at what's already happened as a result of this war, beyond the direct combat. There have been protests against the war held across multiple countries. There have been disruptions to global oil markets and manufacturing supply chains tied directly to the Strait of Hormuz closures. There's been a documented succession crisis inside Iran's own government structure. And now there's a cross-border spillover hitting a Gulf ally that isn't even a party to the conflict. Every one of those factors makes an offensive phase, if it actually materializes the way Rezaei described. Far more dangerous than a simple continuation of the retaliatory strikes we've already seen for months. A retaliatory strike targets what was just hit. An offensive posture, by definition, means Iran choosing its own targets on its own timeline without waiting to be struck first. That's an entirely different risk calculus for every country with military assets or civilians anywhere near the Gulf. So where does this actually go from here? There are really only two paths. Either the US pauses or scales back this bombing campaign to avoid pushing Tehran into that declared offensive phase, or the strikes continue through the weekend as planned, in which case, based on what we just heard directly from Iranian military leadership, we should expect Iran's response to look fundamentally different than anything we've seen across the last 4.5 months of this war, including the initial retaliation back in February and March. And that's the uncomfortable truth here. 7 nights of bombing didn't break Iran's resolve, and neither did the killing of its supreme leader back in February, and neither did months of blockade. If anything, based on this warning, the current campaign may have pushed Tehran's new leadership closer to a decision point they'd been trying to avoid ever since the Islamabad memorandum was signed. That's where things stand right now, and we'll be tracking this hour by hour as it develops. If Iran does shift into that offensive phase this weekend, we'll have the breakdown up as soon as it's confirmed. So make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because the next 48 hours could define how this entire war plays out from here. Let me know in the comments. Do you think this is a real shift in Iran's strategy? Or is this posturing meant to bring the US back to the negotiating table one more time? I'll be reading through the comments and responding to the ones that make the strongest case either way. See you in the next one.